Now, sliding basslines can be a little bit more tricky than other types of basslines to create because there's not a lot of tutorials on them. And for example, an offbeat bass or triplet bassline is a little bit easier because it follows the same general recipe as a rolling bassline, which is the type of bassline that most tutorials cover. So in this installment of Sound Design September, I want to show you how to make sliding basslines in the style of Neelix, Rider, or Ranji. So this is the bassline that we'll be looking into today. Keep in mind, this isn't mixed in any way, these are just the dry serum patches over here and over here. And of course, if you want to use these patches, they're going to be available up on my Patreon page. So if you just want to drag the sounds in there and immediately play with them, you can. Now the bassline, as you can see, uses the Iconess kick waveform. This is a very popular waveform for creating side basses. And the reason for that is we get the kind of phase shifting effect that we often want to get out of the processing on our bassline. But we get it without any of the negatives of that processing because we have it in the oscillator. Of course, I've done various different tutorials on basslines in which I mentioned this kind of technique. So if you want to learn more about the technical details on why this is beneficial, make sure that you check out those videos. Anyway, we have two oscillators of them, and as you can see, they have different wavetail positions. This is very interesting because, as you can see, this is a mono oscillator. So this is in the center, and this is going to be for the left and the right channel separately. So that means that for the stereo bass, we can set a different tonality than for a mono bass. Now, as you can see, both of these oscillators are being modulated on their level, and so is the filter cutoff of this filter over here. The final thing that I should say is that the phase randomization on both oscillators is all the way off. And here, the phase, we don't have to set it right before this click over here because we don't necessarily want a transient. As you can see, we have all of this space where the bassline isn't playing. So that means that we don't really care about the starting point of the bassline because this is where the kick is going to be playing anyway. And the space also gives the bassline time in the oscillator B over here for these two waveforms to go out of phase because they're slightly detuned. They still have the same starting position because of the randomization, and then they're slowly going to drift away from each other, meaning that that drifting is what is causing the stereo effect in this bassline, and that effect is also fully predictable and fully stable, so every bassline is going to have the same stereo image. And this is just a nice consequence of how these basslines are created with the little bit of space that we have in the front over here. Of course, on a rolling bassline, this isn't really something that you would do normally, but here we have the right conditions to apply a technique like this. Anyway, after that, we have a little bit of basic processing over here just to make the bassline a little bit fatter. We have this final EQ over here that is really scooping out the mid-range and slightly boosting the low end. And then finally, to tame any of the high frequencies that are coming out of this compressor over here, we have this last filter over here. Now, just on its own, this patch is a little bit boring. You can use it like this, but it's lacking a little bit of groove. So we have this second layer over here. This isn't really generating any of the lower frequencies. That is already being taken care of, but we just want to add a little bit of extra mid-range. And what I did to create this patch is just duplicate that other patch over and made some modifications to it. So as you can see, the sliding is coming in a little bit later, and it's also given a little bit more of a plug feeling. You can also see that the filter cutoff is slightly higher so that we get a little bit more mid-range out of that. And then the final effect that we have over here is we've added a hyper dimension for some extra stereo width. That does mean though that this layer isn't predictable anymore. It is not stable like the other layer that we saw, but that doesn't really matter anymore, because this is like a texture layer on top of it and it's not our main bassline. You can see also the EQing is different. Of course, what we really want is we want this kind of mid-range over here. And then again, together the two layers are going to sound something like this. So as you can tell, these sliding progressive basslines are pretty simple in their core concept. But when it comes to the details, there's a lot that you need to take into account. So now let's have a deeper look at that by making a bassline from scratch. So we're going to create a new MIDI track. We're again going to go into Serum. It doesn't really matter which synth you use. Of course, Serum by default just has the Iconess kick wavetable, which this bassline relies on. But if you have both Serum and Vital installed, for example, you could also make this in Vital and maybe experiment with some different filter types or stuff like that. And of course, you're going to get small differences in the characteristics of those sounds. And that might be an interesting way to explore some different textures. Speaking about texture, the main texture from our bassline is of course going to come from the wavetail position over here. you can both hear and see the kind of phasing effect that we get from this wavetail position change. Now personally for my main layer, I like a little bit less of a processed sound, something like this. So now we'll set up the sliding effect by doing something like that. So here we have a nice open slide. Maybe we'll even have it slide in a little bit more like that. So it's nice and smooth here. And then we'll apply that to the level. Of course, we're going to need to fine tune this shape to get the exact tonality that we want. And then we'll apply the filter here. Let's set it to something like this. And also apply the filter cutoff modulation. And now for our first oscillator setup, all we have to do is turn down the randomness. And now we can get our second oscillator by just going in copy oscillator A to B with modulations. And we'll just set this to 2 voices and turn the detune down a little bit like this. And of course, route oscillator B through the filter. So now we get something that sounds like this. As you can hear, because of the effect that we have over here for the stereo width, we get of course some phase cancellation between the frequencies of these 2 oscillators. Again, this is playing in mono, so this is in both speakers, and here we have one waveform in the left speaker and one waveform in the right speaker, and they are both slightly detuned with this oscillator over here, meaning that they're going to drift more and more apart. And that is cool for the first kind of pump that we get out of this sound, but we don't want that repeating because then we get more and more drift and that is going to sound a little bit odd. So the way that you work around that issue is you just go into the MIDI, and let's see the MIDI over here, and you just play individual beats as notes, meaning that for safety we can set this LFO to be an envelope instead so that it just plays once. So now we have the actual basis of our bass line. Let's do a little bit of processing. Let's start with an OTT style compressor over here. As you can hear, we're getting a little bit of extra grittiness out of that, and I want a little bit more through some saturation. Let's maybe go with a soft clipper. And now we get those higher mids kind of ringing in there, which is kind of what we want, because that is going to allow us to duplicate this over and make the other patch, the other layer. So for now, what I want to do is I really just want to EQ out that kind of middle scoop frequency here. Maybe a little bit higher. And then finally, to control the high end, what we're going to do is add that filter again. I'm just quickly going to copy over the MIDI so that we have it in here, like this. And we already should get something that sounds like this. And where the real details of this sound should be judged is how it's going to connect to the kick. So that is what we're going to listen to now. I think that's roughly where we want to be in terms of texture. So now let's duplicate this over so that we can make our mid layer. And for the mid layer, I want to go with a little bit more of a plucky feeling, like we saw before. Something like this. And now instead of the low frequencies, we can start to carve out the mid-range. So let's turn off the filter over here and reset these to a low pass and a high pass. And we'll give it a little bit of extra stereo width with the dimension in this case. We can also change the processing to a little bit more of a higher type like this. And then in the context with our other bass layer, we get something that sounds like this. Now that we have two patches that we have made in roughly the same way, the final thing that I want to show you is how you can match them. So what I could do instead is turn on the first lower layer. So now we get something like this. And then of course we can try the other two as well. Maybe we do like this kind of layer over here, but it needs a little bit of a lower volume. So I can go into the patch over here. That sounds a little bit more balanced. And as you can imagine, you can make like 3 or 4 slightly different bass patches and then choose the one that you like most. So that's going to be it for today. I hope that you enjoyed them. If you want all 4 of these patches, again, they're going to be available on my Patreon page. And of course, that is also a great way of supporting the channel, so thank you. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content. So I'm going to leave 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy it, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.